This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin. Joining me this week, a pair of Justice League members who I have no memory of, Paul Jasley.
Hello, humanoids.
And Kara Shamborsky.
Hey.
Today, we are here to talk about episode 305. We're talking about Final Crisis today. I just want to give you a heads up. It's a pretty big episode, all things considered. Maybe the biggest episode I Read Comic Books has ever recorded. But before we get into any of that, and before Kara really regurgitates all the food she had for breakfast and lunch today, I got to shout out two things. For one, I want to say fuck yeah to the Comic Book Workers United Union for forming over at Image Comics. Has not been voluntarily recognized by Image, which is kind of shitty. Ooh. That being said, I'm very excited to see that this union is forming. I think it's a great step forward for all comic book creators and all the people working in the comic book industry. And the other thing I want to shout out is our latest and greatest, maybe, Patreon supporter. His name is Paul. Paul, welcome to I Read Comic Books. I hope you enjoy everything that we offer over at the Patreon. I think you're going to have a really good time. We hope to see you over in the Discord as well. So all that being said, we're here to talk about comic books. So I got to ask these two legally mandated questions, which are, how have you been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you, Paul.
Hey, Mike. I've been doing all right. Coming off a little bit of a cold, but the sort of silver lining of that is that I spent a lot of time just hanging out at home, reading comics this past weekend. So I have a lot to talk about. And I chose two books specifically that I thought would be fun to chat about here on the show. One is The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Cartoonist by Adrian Tomine. This came out last year, and I have to confess, Adrian Tomine is one of those creators whose work I've always wanted to like more than I really do.
Sure.
His work, his line work, his cartooning is absolutely gorgeous. It's so precise and clean. Mm-hmm. It's so visually appealing. And I love the way his books look. If you're not familiar with his work, he did Optic Nerve, which was self-published for a while and was eventually picked up by Drawn and Quarterly. He did Summer Blonde, Killing and Dying, and this newest book. But there's something about a lot of his stories, his fictional work, that feels emotionally hollow. It's like a great late 90s indie rom-com where it's like, sure, these people are very attractive. I like the way it's filmed, but there's no emotional sort of vibrancy to the story. It's just kind of there. You know what I mean? It's like a
Sure.
Wes Anderson movie in some sense.
Yes. There's like a flatness to it that you don't know how to really put your thumb on. I totally get that.
Yeah. But I've tried to read his stuff because, again, visually, it's so much my style. But this book I really, really enjoyed because it was autobiographical. There was an immediate hook to it. As the title suggests, it's about Tomine's experiences as a cartoonist, traveling to conventions, going to book signings, doing media appearances. And the way it's presented is as a notebook. So the actual physical book that Drawn and Quarterly put together, it looks like a hardcover, like moleskin journal. You know, it's got the little ribbon for the bookmark. It's got the little elastic band to put around the side. It's the hash marked grid paper. And then Tomine's artwork is a little bit looser and sketchier, like it's his sketchbook. But what's great is that he's not afraid to show how many indignities he's suffered being a cartoonist, you know, from people mispronouncing his last name to people confusing him for Dan Klaus, which happens more than once.
I never would have drawn that together in my head, but as soon as you said it, I went, yeah, that totally tracks.
Exactly, yeah. And, you know, him going to book signings and no one showing up and all the things that he's suffered as being a cartoonist, it's absolutely hilarious until the final chapter, which gets deadly serious. And what I really like is that such a dramatic tonal shift that Tomine pulls off that he can only do by being brutally honest with his heart on his sleeve and not pulling any punches. Like, it's really an incredible book, how much of his soul and his inner life and his inner mind he's willing to put on the page. And it reminded me like how much I wanted that from his fictional work. You know what I mean? So it's a tremendously well done comic. It's one of those things, I'm reading it and I checked out from the library about halfway through the book. I thought, I need to buy a copy of this. It's so lovely. And what's also great is because it is about his experiences at comic book conventions, you can play Spot the cartoonist in the background. So it's like, oh, I'm pretty sure that's Chris Ware. I'm pretty sure that guy in the background is Jim Rugg. I think that's John Byrne. You know, you're like playing like, because he's drawing people, he doesn't always name who they are in the background. So that's kind of fun game to play.
That's fun.
there was this story about Frank Miller mispronouncing his last name at a convention when he gets nominated for Eisner. That's always good for a laugh riot. So
Right. You posted this, and I didn't even realize that it had come out because I was looking forward to whatever Tomine put out next, because I really liked his Killing and Dying. I thought that was actually a pretty good book overall. Like, some of the stories were hit or miss, but again, with an anthology series of stories, that's going to happen. But I didn't realize that this had come out, so I'm very excited to put this on my Christmas wish list. I will do everybody out there a service, whoever shops for me. I'm just saying this is a blanket statement. I'm terrible to shop for as far as gifts and stuff, and people are always like, Mike, what comics can I get you? And I'm like, I don't want anybody to ever buy me a comic book ever, because I have a very specific set of comic books that I want. But I can put this on that list, and then maybe someone will buy it for me as a gift.
Well, Santa Claus. I think Santa Claus buys gifts, Mike. Come on.
Oh, right. Sorry. Santa will
Claus
then,
makes them excuse you.
Right.
Oh,
Santa will then
he'll
infringe on the copyright in order to get me a copy of this book. I don't understand how that works.
It's complicated.
It's complicated.
Long story short, it's a tremendously good comic. If you like Tomine stuff, you're going to like this. If you're someone that's maybe like me on the fence about his work, or have never read his stuff, this is a great place to start. It's one of the best things I read this past year. Speaking of biographical comics published by Drawn and Quarterly, I also read Leonard Cohen, On a Wire. This is a new book, just came out about 2 weeks ago by the Quebecois cartoonist Philippe Girard, translated into English by Helga Dasher and Karen Houle. It is, as the title suggests, a biography of the legendary Canadian poet and songwriter Leonard Cohen, who I guess at this point is best known for writing Zack Snyder's favorite song, Hallelujah.
No. Well, no. Oh.
But
okay.
You know what?
You say Zack Snyder, I say Shrek. Like, that song was in the Shrek soundtrack.
Sure.
I will just say, as an aside, the popularity of that song, the fact it has become so ubiquitous in pop culture, is hilarious to me. Because, like every other Leonard Cohen song, Hallelujah is, at its core, about being horny and Jewish. So the fact you have a children's movie with that song in it and every American Idol contestant sings it is magical to me. So anyway.
Sublime.
All that being said, like I said, this is a book about Leonard Cohen's life. It focuses on more than just that song, thankfully, which is, it's not one of my favorite Leonard Cohen songs, but and what I really like about this book is that it doesn't read like a straightforward biography. It's poetic in a way, if that makes sense. As much as a comic can be poetic, it opens up with Leonard Cohen. He passed away actually 6 years ago today, I believe, or 5 years ago today. It opens up with him lying on the floor after he fell out of bed, and it's his final moments. He's remembering moments of his life. So you kind of get little snippets of his story as it grows up as a young boy, learning to be a poet, and then traveling around the world, becoming a musician, all the famous people he meets, all the famous women he had good times with. And he lived a very full, adventurous life. And what's nice is that it doesn't glamorize anything. It just sort of shows it matter-of-factly. And the cartooning style is very simplistic, but in a way that is evocative. There's a lot of quiet, somber moments in the book, a lot of moments of him reflecting on his life and his craft. It's very hard to illustrate someone writing a song, but somehow Girard's just cartooning of Leonard Cohen holding a guitar and just looking pensive kind of like tells you the inner workings of his mind as he's writing a song. And there's a few little asides in there that I didn't know about, songwriting, how he wrote certain songs or inspiration for certain songs I wasn't aware of. I will say, if you don't know much about Leonard Cohen, this might not be the best place to start, since a lot of it depends on you having a background knowledge of his songs and his personal life. But
sure,
I think it's one of those books that if you do like Leonard Cohen, or maybe only know him from Hallelujah, this would give you a new appreciation for just how long of a career he had and just what an influential character he was in the history of popular music. And it's a book I'm actually kind of looking forward to go back and rereading. I read it last night and I really enjoyed it, but I want to sit down, put some Leonard Cohen records on my turntable, sort of let it unfold before me, kind of let it be a companion to the music, which I think might be a good way to look at it. So I really enjoyed it. Again, Leonard Cohen is someone that I don't listen to a lot of, and I have a handful of favorite songs, but this kind of makes me appreciate his personal life and his craft even more.
All right.
Very cool. I mean, I I don't think I would have ever picked this up, but it sounds interesting. I mean, like, again, I don't really know much about Leonard Cohen, but it does sound like a cool book.
Yeah,
and the art looks really interesting. I looked at a preview of it. It looks very solid. So interesting stuff. Paul, you're going way out there with super indie stuff, man. Good for you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Don't make that sound judgy, Mike. Dang.
Listen, all I'm saying is, like, I feel really basic, like the last couple weeks I've been on the show, where I've just been like Marvel, DC, Marvel, an Image book. Like that's as crazy as I'm getting. So thanks for making me humbling me, Paul, as always.
Of course.
Kara, what about you? How have you been? How have comic books been?
Oh my God. Well, it's finally wintry weather over here, so I am finally able to wear the 6,000 sweatshirts I bought during the pandemic as an expression of wanting to feel cozy and swaddled at all times. So,
right.
On a sartorial level, that's where I'm at. But comic book wise, I could not let go of our recent Comics with Tea episode and wanted to continue the journey. So I read Seance Tea Party by Raymond Yee, expecting it to be an adorable middle grade book about some kind of like ghostly tea party and cute animals and hijinks ensue and everything's like sweet and there's no conflict and whatever. That is not this book. This book made, like, I talk all the time like, this book made me cry. I had so many feelings. I was sobbing alone in my bed to this book.
Oh, no.
It was really, it's just an emotional wrecking ball. It's the premise is this girl has what she says is going to be like a seance tea party with her, like, I think it's like with her stuffed animals or something, and then this ghost girl shows up, and so this girl who's in middle school realizes that there's a ghost girl who appears to be her age living in the attic, and so they become friends. And it could just be like, oh, look, this girl has a ghost girlfriend. Isn't that cute? But instead, it's this exploration of what does it mean like to be a ghost who's trapped in this early adolescent age? And how do you spend your time when your like human friend is at school? And what if you start like reconnecting with who you were when you were alive? And are there people still around who remember you? And
boy.
The whole, like, it's all about like friendship and the angst of feeling like people that you're friends with like no longer have the same interests that you do, and how it's okay because you're always going to keep finding people who do love you for who you are and want to spend time with you and don't want you to change. And I got a little bit of that going on in my life right now, so reading about it was perhaps too real.
Right.
Perhaps too real. It's a very well done book. I loved the illustrations. They edge on the whimsical. Like, I say it's a middle grade book. It like looks like a more painterly style middle grade book, but the themes are definitely not just for kids. Like, you can hand this to an adult who has had a functional relationship in their lives, and they'll be like, why would you do this to my heart? So, it was very beautiful. Loved reading. Don't know if I'd read it again right away, and maybe don't read it when you're feeling a lot of emotions already, but it is a great read. That is my recommendation of what I read this week. And yeah, I'm still recovering from that one. So.
Well, that's okay. Yeah, these Tea Party books have been on my to read list. I read the first one, so I appreciate the warning about this last one.
Wait, no, you're talking about Tea Dragon Society. This is not that.
This is
this is not that thing. There are no magical dragons here.
Okay, I somehow got these wires crossed. That would have been insane, right? If I would have been like, oh, look, the next entry in the Tea Dragon Society, and it's like this.
Not Tea Dragon Society. This is Seance Tea Party.
Okay.
I'm glad we sorted that out.
We're fixing a lot of things today on the show. I appreciate it. Well, for me this week, I was out last week from the show because I was in Philadelphia, and I was doing a really nerdy thing. I was playing Pokemon Go outside with people. There was maybe 2,000 people out at a park in Philadelphia, and so I went down there to go do the Pokemon Go Safari event because I'm a huge nerd, and it was a lot of fun. I walked around a bunch, and I brought fancy rain boots because it was supposed to rain all weekend, and then we had perfect weather. So I did manage to read some comics while I was traveling. I did manage to read some comics over the last couple weeks because obviously it's what I do with all of my time. But so I did manage to sit down and read Time Before Time #6. This was by Declan Shalvey, who was writing as well as doing the art, the pencils, and the inks. Colors by Chris O'Halloran. Letters by Hassan Otsmani Elhau. And this is a beautiful issue. If you normally read Time Before Time, you'll know that Joe Palmer is typically the penciler on this book, but it looks like Declan Shalvey stepped in to do this one-shot that's about a one-off character from the story. And really, I don't really think I have the time or want to spoil the book for you to kind of explain the context of the book. But what I found to be really interesting about this issue is, overall, I think Declan Shalvey, his writing tends to be really geared towards super bleak, crushingly hard-nosed to the ground real-life stories. Even with something like a time-traveling story about a crime syndicate who travels through time to get things and basically make their really bad timeline better by, I don't know, it's complicated. I think Shalvey manages to find a way to just get you back to the basics of this is about a person struggling. All of his stories are about people struggling in ways that put them in scenarios where they have to do bad things in order to survive. And what was interesting about this specific issue is how worse things were for the characters compared to the regular story, compared to the other things. Every turn that all of the characters in this single issue make are just bad. And you feel that just depressing, overwhelming, is there a way to escape this? Is there a way to make things better? Are people making selfish choices because they have no choice or because they are only looking out for number one? Betrayals and left turns and really interesting, just crime stories. It's something that I think I've said on the show before. I fucking love this Time Before Time book, and I think Shalvey totally nails it with this issue. And I mean, that isn't even to start with his art. His art in this issue doesn't feel like his other books. I feel like this issue in particular had a very cinematic feel. It's probably some of the best work that he's ever put out. You can tell there's a lot of passion. You can tell there's a lot of really close collaboration with colorist Chris O'Halloran in this issue, because the color palette, while it intentionally does not match the previous issues of Time Before Time, which was also done by O'Halloran, it all was purposefully done to designate this is a very different, drastic story that takes place in a different time. And so compared to the rest of the storylines, which also take place in different times, but still have a bleakness to them, this one starts with kind of a lighthearted, almost optimism, and ends in this dreary dread, but still using that kind of lighthearted poppy color palette. I found that to be just incredible. And again, this is a wonderful issue. Do not pick it up on its own. I do not recommend you do that. That being said, go pick up the first trade, then grab this issue. You will not be disappointed. I highly recommend this series, and I think Time Before Time, Declan Shalvey, and all the team that he's been working with have been doing a fantastic job making this book kick ass. So highly recommend that.
Yeah, I go back and forth on this book because I'm reading it month to month, and every issue I struggle to remember what happened, which is not a complaint because I had the same thing with Paper Girls, which I loved. But at a certain point, I realized I need to read it in trade or just let the issues pile up and read them in a go. So I haven't gotten to this one yet, but you're making me excited to finally read it.
Yeah, I mean, as a one-off, honestly, all you need to know is the handful of basics that I think the first arc gives you, and this issue kicks butt.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah, so I was really, really impressed. I was floored by the end of this one. It's like watching a good crime movie where at the end, no one's really the winner, even though somebody ended up on top. And that's exactly what this issue was. So I really enjoyed it. The other thing I want to talk about really quick is I also read The Human Target #1 because I had to get on the bandwagon that, like I said earlier, just been reading a lot of big 2 books. That's apparently all I'm doing. But this had Greg Smallwood on it, so I had to pick it up. I love Greg Smallwood. I've loved Greg Smallwood since I saw him way back on Moon Knight and a ton of other stuff. Like, everything that this guy touches is solid gold as far as I'm concerned. His art is some of the best in the industry, hands down. So I wanted to see what this whole business is about, this Human Target thing. You do a quick Google search of Human Target, and boy, oh boy, you see a lot of different things, because apparently this has been a thing for a long time, and I have no idea what the history is. But that being said, this book was it was a little tough to ramp up. Tom King, say what you will about his writing, he's everyone's favorite and least favorite writer out there, and that's fine. I tend to like his stuff a little bit, but just like his Batman book, I felt like this story kind of took its time actually getting to what the actual point was. That being said, the point of this book, the final couple pages of this book, kicked me in the face in the best way. Sure. I really love this whodunit of the series. If you haven't read it, I don't want to spoil it, but man, oh man, I like a good whodunit, and this is what this book is. This our main character, the Human Target, he gets poisoned after working for Lex Luthor, and of course you'd think oh, Lex Luthor did it. He's the bad guy. He's fucking evil, right? Lex Luthor is bad. Just a quick aside, Kara Paul, Lex Luthor's a bad guy, right? And everyone knows that he's a bad guy, and he tells everyone that he's a bad guy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
well, Mike, I'm just gonna say we live in a world with very rich dudes who a lot of people will defend, even though they're objectively evil.
Sure.
So it's not far of a stretch to think Lex Luthor be the same thing.
I was going to say define bad.
Right. Okay. So all that being said, so Lex Luthor kind of obviously hey, you did this. You killed me. You're going to kill me. And fortunately, this guy, he had drank some coffee that was poisonous. And we kind of have to ask the question, who did it? And there's a really interesting twist at the end. And as someone who doesn't read a lot of DC, guys, I say it all the time. I just don't know. And we're going to get to it in the second half about how much I don't read DC. This issue was really interesting. And I'm very excited to explore all of the potential paths that this story is going to take, especially with the one page in this issue that gave us kind of a preview of what might be to come. Premise is solid enough that I'm probably going to try number 2 at least. And I mean, come on, honestly, if you're going to put Greg Smallwood on a book, I can't fucking not pick it up. So here we are.
Yeah. I was going to sit this one out until I saw the preview pages. I'm like, well, King did it again. He hired an artist I cannot resist.
Right.
So,
and it's to the point where there is a fine line that Tom King rides that Mark Millar was on at one point, where you're God damn, he keeps getting people that are just stupendous on his work. And eventually you kind of read 1 or 2 of his books. You go, I don't think I can even follow some of these people into the dark. So that being said, Tom King is not there yet. I'm putting the yet on the end of that.
This
Danny
feels like a book I'll trade weight on, but we'll read eventually.
Sure. Yeah, and it's probably going to be a fantastic trade weight. Honestly, I think that this book is going to read like a dream when it's all collected, but I think that it does work as a month-to-month book, all things considered. So let's move on. Let's talk about comics that are on the top of your pile. Comics are dropping on November 10th, 2021, but what's on the top of your pile? Let's start with you, Paul.
Well, Mike, I'll say this as an aside, as a warning. This is coming out this week on Wednesday. Based on the pile of comics I have waiting for me, I'm not going to get to it right away, but I'm excited to read it. So this is my pick for the week. When I get to it is up to be determined. But it's a new book from Image called What's the Furthest Place from Here? That's the first issue. This is by Tyler Boss, of course, who we all love, and Matthew Rosenberg. And at this point, I just have to say it's a Tyler Boss comic, right? And that's enough to justify picking it. Like if you've read Four Kids Walk Into the Bank or Dead Dog's Bite, his most recent book, I can't resist his stuff. I love Tyler Boss's look. I love his aesthetic. This book apparently is a comic about a gang of teenagers navigating a post-apocalyptic wasteland. I'm there for that. And if you are wondering, I'm buying the regular edition of this comic. I know that each issue, there's also going to be a special limited edition of the issue that comes with a bonus 7-inch. And you'd think that would be my thing, right?
Yeah, I think they're just doing that for the first issue, just for the record.
Oh, okay.
Just the first one.
Gotcha.
They were running into supply chain issues. with the vinyl in the first place. Sorry, continue, Paul. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Right, because someone had to press 500,000 copies of Adele's records, so no indie bands could get any records made for the next year. Anyway, I'm not going to buy that. It's $15. I just can't justify that. Although if I see it in the store, that might change my mind. Okay. But I guess long story short, it's a sort of music-themed post-apocalyptic wasteland book by Tyler Boss. As Stan the Man said, enough said.
I did pre-order the $15 edition with the 7-inch, so
good for
maybe I will, we can share it or something like that. I'll send you it. You can play it on your record player because I fucking don't have one.
Oh my God.
Listen, I have. Okay, let me just be completely honest. I have a record player. It's just at my sister's house in Michigan that I will one day recollect from her.
One day you'll have it.
Yeah, one day. We'll see. It's been in her house for 6 years, but one day.
You know what, Mike? I bought a Switch Lite case, and I don't own a Switch Lite yet. So it's like sometimes you just have pieces of things that will someday be assembled.
Yes,
sure.
Kara, what about you? What's on the top of your pile?
Oh, top of my pile is the book Spinning by Tilly Walden, and I'm not going to get into it because I don't want to know too much about it. All I know is that both Kates have recommended it.
I also recommend it, yeah.
You told me specifically to drink wine while reading it because it will be sad. Yeah. So all I know about it is that you told me I would need alcohol to get through it and that there's a ballerina on the cover. So with those two things, I know I'm setting myself up for another Seance Tea Party, but you know what? It'll be fine. I'm sure it'll be fine. Other top of my list is I ordered the new collected edition of the Fraction Aha Hawkeye in gleeful expectation of the Disney Plus TV show, which is set in New York during Christmas time, my favorite time of the year to be in New York. So I'm like, you took the best comic, the best superhero comic of the last 10 years. I said it. And made it set in my favorite place at my favorite time. Give it to me immediately. But I want to reread the comic before I watch it because I'm that person, and it is a sublime comic book.
Are we doing a live to tape Patreon series for this? Is that what I'm hearing? Week to week Hawkeye episodes? Could you imagine?
I'm listening.
I'm sipping on that tea. More to come.
Okay.
Listen, I'm not pushing that on anybody, but it sounds like we might be able to do it.
Let's talk. Have your people call mine.
Yeah, well, we'll get it out. We'll get it on all settled over email. Well, for me, I guess before I jump into my top of my pile, I'm going to shout out some Discord folks that are hanging out with us. Danny's pick this week is Venom #1, and Brian's pick is Life is Strange: Settling Dust #2. No surprises. No surprises there. For me this week, I was gonna say my pick is gonna surprise everyone. Xander's gonna have to have a musical cue for this, but did you guys see that John Leguizamo has a comic book coming out this week called Phenom X? Like he's a co-writer on it. It's coming out from Image Comics. Okay. I was like, wow, that's wild. Anyways, but the book that I'm excited for this week. This may shock folks at home. So Xander, cue up that Eminem song. Venom #1. Me and Danny riding to the ends of the earth. This is Al Ewing, Ram V on writing with Brian Hitch on art. The only thing I have to say is this is so dumb. Why am I even trying this comic? However, the preview is promising. Venom. They're promising a Venom horror story, and Ewing and Ram V. Like, come on, like these guys they're masters of their craft. So I definitely am willing to try at least the #1. Brian Hitch, I can take or leave. Who cares? But nonetheless, this looks like it could be fun, and we'll see what's going to happen. It's $6, so it better be worth something.
Damn. Okay.
Besides, I will say, how else am I supposed to continue my irrational avoidance of Donny Cates by not picking up his Hulk book and instead picking up the Venom book that he just left? I have a brand.
Mike, that's really petty.
Listen, I have a brand. Okay. Anyways, I should be picking the 6 sidekicks of Trigger Keaton #6, but I genuinely want to try this Venom #1. It looks, we'll see what's going to happen. I've never read a Venom book before, really. Like, I think I tried some stuff back in the day when it was like super military Venom or whatever. I don't remember what that was about. So this is going to be me kind of diving headfirst into a world of Venom that I just don't understand beyond in any capacity, because I don't even think that the Venom movies are worth even touching on to make this whole thing happen. So anyways, that's me. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on this Venom book, but I'm at least going to try it.
They're still trying to make Venom happen, which is always interesting to me.
Venom is I've never read a Venom book, but when I think of Venom, I'm just like, the 90s. Like,
right.
But the most 90s thing.
He's such a popular character. Like, people love Venom. You know what? So I guess maybe this will be the book that gets me in the Venom camp, right? Anyways,
I don't know. Venom seems kind of edgelordy to me.
I know. And
I'm just saying, yeah. I mean, Brian Hitch is fine. He's all right. But I mean, if it's not drawn by Toddy Mack, I got no use for Venom. If McFarlane's not drawing it, what's the point?
Well, that's why I was like intrigued by what some people say about the movies, which is they're basically a weird rom-com where the like odd couple partners are within the same being.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And, I could wrap my head around that. I just don't know if that's what the comics also do.
Danny, verified Venom Stan is saying that they are a weird rom-com. So you know what? I think that all tracks. Sure. Anyways, we're going to take a quick break. In the break, you guys are going to hear an interview that I did with Cavan Scott, writer of Shadow Service, Star Wars, The High Republic, like that series that's coming out right now, Doctor Who, plenty of other, so many freaking comics and prose books. This dude must be writing nonstop. He's writing right now. I'm certain of it. But yeah, Cavan Scott did a great interview with him. He's such a nice guy to talk to. So check that out. And then after that, I'm going to have a crisis as we talk about Final Crisis. So we'll be back in just a moment. Today on I Read Comic Books, I am sitting down and talking to the one and only Cavan Scott, creator of a ton of comics, ton of prose books, a ton of so many different things. Cavan, you are one of the most prolific writers I think we've ever talked to on the show. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
I'm really excited today to talk about your new series, or the latest volume of your series, Shadow Service. Volume 2 just came out from Vault Comics with art by Corin Howell, colored by Triona Farrell. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Shadow Service?
Sure, yeah. So Shadow Service is my first creator-owned comic. I've been writing sort of licensed books and things like that for nearly 20 years now, ranging from everything from Doctor Who to Pacific Rim to Star Wars to Vikings to all kinds of things, really. And while I've done original prose, I've never really had a chance to do an original comic before. And yeah, I was chatting to Vault, and Shadow Service was the result. And it really is it's the inside of my brain. It's everything I've been obsessed with since I was a kid. Growing up in the UK, as people might gather from my accent, in the late 70s, it meant that I officially had to like James Bond. It was actually, treason if you didn't. It was, and Roger Moore was Bond, and as far as I was concerned, there was never another. I remember seeing Sean Connery and going, "Who's this Joker? And how the hell does he think he's James Bond?" And so I was obsessed about James Bond, and I was obsessed with monsters, and that largely originally came from my love of things like the original series of Doctor Who, Return of the Jedi with Jabba's Palace, which led me along the path of Hammer horror and Universal horror, and then horror in general. And so I became obsessed with the idea of a James Bond type figure fighting monsters. And again, that has a lot to do with some of the comics of the day that were coming out over here. We used to have something called Scream, which was a short-lived comic. It was a weekly comic along the lines of 2000 AD, which is another sort of weekly classic over here. But this was horror-based completely. And it had on the front cover, "Not for the Nervous," like a stamp on it every week. And it was, to be fair, looking back now, Actually, I can believe it was aimed at kids because a lot of the stuff aimed at kids in the 70s in the UK seemed to be designed to scar them completely. And so, we would have public service announcements when you got Donald Pleasance hissing as death and inviting people to go and play in rivers because you might drown. It was I love it when they play in the streams, and it's like and so we had this all the stuff. It was literally everywhere, and I remember a few years ago I was working on some Choose Your Own Adventure books, and I showed my editor some of the stuff we had over here, which was called Fighting Fantasy, which, you go into, and there's one of the first choices you make in some of those books, you turn to the page and there's hanged zombies, hanging from nooses and stuff. And so it was kids and horror went together quite well in the UK in the late 70s, early 80s. And in Scream particularly, there was this script called The Dracula File, which was about Dracula, as you imagine. The point of the strip was that Dracula had the KGB had been dealing with Dracula for many years in Russia and in the Eastern Bloc, and they discovered that he'd gone to the UK. And so they were like, well, brilliant. Let the Prince of Darkness go to the UK, because then they can deal with him. He can destroy them, and we'll walk in. And one KGB officer defects because he can't allow that to happen because he's too many innocent people are going to die. And I followed that strip every week, and it really influenced things like Shadow Service, because it's that idea of secret services working against supernatural forces. And the funny thing was, then as Shadow Service came out, because of Shadow Service, I was asked if I would like to write the coda in the revived Scream of Dracula File last year. So I sort of wrote the last chapter of it, which was really odd because it really was like a circular thing and coming back.
That's crazy,
it was great. And so, a lot of those things in Doctor Who, there was Unit, which was a sort of Black Ops group who probably were the worst Black Ops group in the world because everyone seemed to know about them, and they were always fighting aliens and monsters. So that kind of thing it lived in my brain ever since, and I was always writing stories about secret agents going up against demons and vampires and werewolves. And for a long time, actually, when I started to write professionally, I used to write short stories for fanzines and small presses, and wrote about this group called MI666, who were basically it was the proto Shadow Service. And I tried out different ways, and none of the characters really worked. And I'd always come back to this idea. And then when I was asked by Volt if I would like to put together something, it was just the perfect timing, and everything sort of crystallized in my mind when I was thinking about it, and that became Shadow Service. So it's a proper continuation of an obsession I've had for decades. And so if you look at Shadow Service, there's lots of little Easter eggs to old obscure British horror movies and Doctor Who and things like that, because it is my sort of love letter to those kind of stories, but hopefully bringing something new to it and taking it a little step further, and largely because of Corinne as well, who hasn't got that background at all. And so she's just come into it for a love of horror comics and action. So between the two of us, I think those two things, and we spend a lot of time talking about horror movies between us. So those two things have come together to form the comic.
Yeah, and it's quite a comic. Like I was gonna say, I was curious about how you manage to take what feels like pulls from all sorts of different genres and mash them into one book. Like you've got police procedural stuff, you've got horror elements, you've got like the mystical world. I mean, there's so many different monsters and baddies you could throw into a series like this. I absolutely enjoyed how much potential the overall series had. I mean, do you see this as being like a forever kind of series that you could write to the end of time, or is there like a definitive end that you think you'll have with Shadow Service?
Well, the minute we've got a new arc which is coming. We haven't got a date yet, but it's we're working on it at the minute, so it's going to be early next year, and we'll probably have that date pretty soon because we'll have to have solicitors soon, and so that sort of pushes on the story. We initially did the 10. And it was well received, so we've pushed forward onto it. I'm the kind of writer that needs to know how things are going to end. So I do have an ending in mind. I like to have an ending in mind for every story, and not necessarily a full plan of how we're going to get there. So there's still room to maneuver, but I definitely like to know where I'm going. And so there is an image that I've had in my head for a last scene of Shadow Service, but even that last scene has the opportunity to have life be, for life to continue beyond it, because it is that kind of tradition of, James Bond will return, and it's
Right.
and it was so nice. And the last, when I wrote the issue 10 script, by that point we confirmed that we were going to come back for another arc, and so I could write Shadow Service will return on the last panel. So that was a nice little moment for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we've got plans for at least, I've got plans in my head for at least 3 more arcs to get us to that point. And obviously this is comics, so you don't know what the future is going to bring, but that's definitely where we're aiming. And it's definitely what I've got planned out. So as I said, absolutely got the end point in mind, but I've left myself some options that so Corin and I can work together in different ways together.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, when you introduce like a new, I guess, I don't know what you call it, like department in the United Kingdom, like, or at least in the government, you kind of imply that there is a foreverness to it, that it's always been, it will forever will be, kind of thing, which I find to be really fascinating. And the idea of MI666, or the official name in the book, was really tickling to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm excited to see what the potential. I mean, like, and new potential characters. I mean, especially given how the developments of the first 2 volumes. I think there's a lot of opportunity for new things to be introduced, and new characters to come about and stuff. Which kind of brings me to my next question about like your main character. Gina Myers, private detective, meets this. I don't know how to describe this character other than to say, like, the infinite forever will be Hex. I don't really know without getting too into the details about it.
Hex is interesting because actually he existed in previous incarnations of MI666 when I was writing it as short stories.
Okay.
But he was very different in those points.
Right.
So, but Hex has always been, in any iteration of the character that sort of led to this point, he's always been around a very long time. Hex, for people who don't know, he looks like we're anywhere between sort of 8 and 12, depending on how you want to age him, and but he's infinitely older than that, and so well, not infinitely. There is, he's been around for centuries, and and he has been part of this organization for a very long time. And again, it comes back to my love of horror and creepy kids. And one thing I love about, I have so many things about Corin's work, but I love the way she draws Hex, because he is so calm and so controlled in his little Lord Fauntleroy suit, drinking his China cups of tea.
I was getting very Children of the Corn vibes in some panels.
No, absolutely. I mean, we described him in the first, when we were talking about it. He's like a combination between Children of the Corn, Slappy from is it Slappy from Goosebumps? The ventriloquist dummy. And I think in the first issue in the script, that he appears in the first issue that he appears in, I think it's issue 2. I described him and and said something like, and Gina will hate him right down to his sinister freckles, and sinister freckles became a byword for him after that point. So but what we'll see when we see Shadow Service come back is that we'll see their relationship change, because she is by this point, and for people who haven't read it, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but she's immersed in herself. She's a detective. She's a street detective, or private detective, a street witch, we call her, who uses her powers to be a private detective to find people, and gets recruited by the Secret Service that deals specifically with supernatural shenanigans. And so her relationship is strained, to say the least, through most of the first mission. But when Shadow Service returns, we're going to see that a little bit of time has passed, and she is, she's a member of the team by this point, and so she is starting to have relationships within the organization, build those relationships, and bordering on friendships. And I don't want to get into who those friendships are, but her relationship with Hex is going to be interesting, because he wants her there, because Hex is the ultimate user. He likes finding people who are broken that he can then mold into weapons of his own, basically. And so he in Gina, he sees such potential, and also a mystery, because she's a character that he's seen everything. He's seen empires, the British Empire rise and fall. He's seen monarchs come and go. He's seen governments come and go. And in Gina, he's seen someone that he's never seen before. He's seen something that works within the magic she uses that he's never experienced. And so to him, she's fascinating, and he doesn't want to let her go because she is new, and he hasn't had a lot of new in his life for a long time.
Yeah, I found the whole magic system of this world to be really, really interesting, and how it varied from character to character. And I think getting a story like this where everything's coming kind of from Gina's perspective for the most part, and we're finding out things as she's finding out things, to be really, really cool. I guess, I don't know if you have like a whole detailed like manifesto about how the entire magic system works in this world, but could you give us a little bit of peek as to like what the drive was? Because that it looks like there's just like keywords and all this other stuff. Is there more to it than that?
Magic in Shadow Service is largely vocal magic, so it's largely magic words and spoken magic. Even though there are various different demonic powers that can do different things as well, but definitely from the main source of magic in the world, it's vocal. What makes Gina interesting is the fact that she's never been trained, and she just knows the words. And so there is a mystery there that Hex is fascinated by, because Hex has been trained for a very long time. He was a disciple of a guy called John Dee, who was a real person in English history. He was the sort of the astrologer and advisor and mathematician to Queen Elizabeth I. He is the original 007, because he used to sign his letters 007 to Queen Elizabeth because people were saying he was a spy. And by all evidence that's been found, he did absolutely used to spy on European courts and send information back. And it would always be signed 007, which is where Ian Fleming got the code name from.
No way.
So in the story, Hex was trained by John Dee, and so his form of magic is based on the magic that in the real world, in our world, John Dee used to say existed, because he believed he used to talk to angels and used to scry, and he had Enochian magic, which was all to do with language. So that's sort of the basis for the magic system that I've built. But cool. For Gina, she usually, the idea is that usually it's passed on, and it's knowledge that's passed on. But in moments of stress, she says at one point, "I've heard these words in my head all my life, and I've never known what they are and what they mean. But when she needs to use them, she will use them, and it's an instinct for her." And so she can instinctively use magic, which is not the way magic works for everyone else in the universe. So so Hex is fascinated, and as we go into the new arc, which will be coming next year, she's trying to explore where this has come from as well, because of revelations that happen in the second volume.
Gotcha.
She's starting to explore, because she's just always accepted this. She thought she was unique. She thought that she knew magic existed because she could do it, and her best friend was a talking rat. So she knew that the world wasn't always what you thought it was. But she did think that it was, she was a freak. And now she's found out that through the work that she's done with MI666, she's worked out that the world is quite freaky, actually, and she's just a part of it. So she's starting to explore and enjoy what she can do and enjoy her power.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's this makes me even more excited for the next volume, because these are all the questions that I have as a reader that I want to find out. So I can't wait for the next volume. I guess to move on a little bit, I'm curious. You've done a lot of work for big properties, like you mentioned before, like Doctor Who, Pacific Rim. I mean, Star Wars, The High Republic. Like these are humongous names in like licensed comics and stuff. How did your work for something like Shadow Service differ from how you approach work for those properties?
Well, obviously, the biggest difference is you haven't got to persuade at least 17 people to let you tell a story, So all of those, when you're working for someone else's sandpit, and this goes for everything from working on something like Star Wars or Doctor Who, or working with DC on their heroes. You have to build your reputation within those groups, and you're almost persuading people that you can be trusted with their creations, and as part of that process, you outline heavily and you send stuff through. And for Star Wars in particular, there is an entire group of people who are called Story Group, whose job it is to make sure that continuity works and that the stories match everything else in that particular galaxy. And so you go through a lot of processes. I think worked in that world in that way so long that when it actually came back to doing my own things again, after I said I've done some prose work that's my own, but then I suddenly realised, well, hang on, the only one I've got to prove this really is me, and Corinne, and obviously work with the editors with Tay and Adrian at Volt, but I haven't got to go and send it off to make sure it's not going to contradict the film that's happening at the same time, So that actually makes a massive difference. And at first, it's terrifying because there's no borders, there's no boundaries, there's no one telling you can't do that. And sometimes those moments can bring the most creativity, So I've been working with DC quite a bit on various things, some of which have been announced, some not. And there's a series I've got at the minute called Titans United from DC, which is a sort of version of the Teen Titans, which is the lineup from the TV show, but it's nearer the comic continuity, but it's not quite the comic continuity because DC, there's because multiverse. And with that, I had such a almost like a shopping list of things it had to do and characters it had to involve. So you get that blueprint, and then you write a story through within those parameters. And actually, sometimes, you can sit there going, well, how am I going to bring that character? How am I going to do that? But that's the fun of it. But also, when you sit down, you know what you can do and what you can't. When you're obviously working on your own own projects, the person that tells you can't do something is yourself. And so you have to work out what those parameters are. So at first it can be quite scary, and you have to sort of give yourself permission to make those decisions that you make decisions that, and you haven't actually got a fight to try and keep them, which is something that can happen. You have to choose your battles when you're working in licensed comics or in licensed material, because sometimes you believe passionately that, Aquaman should do this. But at one point and you fight that point, but there will be a point when the editor says, well, no, Aquaman can't. And so, that's all part of the game when you're working on your own material now. And I've got some more creator-owned titles coming out over the next year or so with various other publishers. And
nice.
It's amazing. It's great. I'm really looking forward to them being out there. But you have that thing of like, you have to, it's all on your shoulders, which is at first scary, but I'm really embracing it now because I'm really enjoying the freedom it's given you to do. Say, this is the book I want to do completely. You haven't got to make the compromises, really.
Right.
Other than within your own team. And obviously that's something, the one good thing about working in this world, working in any comics, is you have to be a team player. There's no two ways about that. And your career won't last very long if you're not. And so when I come to this, and quite often, because I came up with the idea for Shadow Service first, and then we brought on Corin, because I worked in shared universes and things like the High Republic, when there are so many people involved across so many different media, I'm used to going, okay, we can't do this, but what about if we do that? And I'm used to finding ways around, and I'm used to other people having to put input in.
Right.
So when you bring in an artist and they turn around and say, oh, what about this? Sometimes as a writer who's created something and then you've brought someone in, your hackles go up and you're like, no, it shouldn't be like that. But because of my background, I think I've adapted to that way of work anyway. So if Corin comes and brings something to the table that isn't what I was thinking about, I don't necessarily just go yes to everything. But it's definitely it evolves the story every time. And actually, I never expected Shadow Service to have so many monsters in it, which, for me is a crazy thing to say because it's what I love. I think originally I sold it on the pitch of Tinker Tailor Soldier a Witch. And so I think in my mind, I had it a little bit more that sort of John le Carré, more sort of hard-bitten espionage novel kind of thing with less fantastical elements in it. But then I saw how much fun Corin was having drawing demons. And how much fun I was getting those pages through, and so that's when we decided, all right, all bets are off. We're going to go massive, we're going to go demon right the way down. And there's so many elements like that in the book which I've loved, and why I love comics in general. If you read Shadow Service, you'll notice there's these big skeletal statues that turn up quite a lot in the background, which is was 100% Corin. I think there's one in one of the early issues, Hex is doing a ritual, and he sat in front of this amazing Baphomet angel skeletal creature thing, which is a statue in the middle of MI666, apparently. And that came back, and Corinne said, "What about this?" And I was like, "What? What's that?" And then I went, "Yes, obviously." And then the next issue there was another one in the background of, they've got a mobile headquarters, which is in a white transit van, which is in a little, nod to some of the work I've done in the past, is much bigger on the inside than it is on the outside.
Right.
And in the middle of that, she drew one of these amazing, huge skeletal angels again. And so there's a bit later on, I think around sort of issue 8 or 9, where you see what those skeletal angels are. And that was always part of the story, but I didn't actually know what they were, these creatures. And then I just realized it was staring me in the face, and Corinne had been placing them there in the background. So it was one of those moments when you have a perfect combination of a concept and an idea, and the artist has already sort of been putting that work in, and you can bring it all together. And that's what makes comic work so fascinating and so brilliant. And and I think it helps to come from that background, that you can maneuver quickly. And sometimes when you're working on something like, not so much on the High Republic, because that's something I've been involved in, sort of like creating from the ground up. Mm-hmm. But I've done Star Wars work when I've dealt with something that's sort of linking into like Solo. And when something changed in Solo, then it had a ripple effect through all the linked media, and so you have to move quickly. And so that kind of ability to think on your feet and adjust. And you get this as well if you're working with the big two on superhero stuff, because obviously something else can happen in another part of the universe and affect what you're doing.
Right.
I think that really helps when you're working on your creator-owned stuff, because it gives you the flexibility to move with what the rest of the team are doing and to react to it.
Yeah, and I think Shadow Service definitely benefits from it, because some of those demon monster things that we saw were
amazing,
incredible in this book. I'm telling you, folks, if you haven't read this book, check it out. The first, second volumes are available. They're amazing. I guess my last question here for you, so we can wrap up, is what kind of comics do you like to read? Have you been reading anything interesting recently that you'd like to tell the folks at home about?
Well, I think anyone reads any of my stuff, and I probably include Star Wars in there as well, knows that I love horror, and I love horror comics. I think, I do read a heck of a lot of superhero comics. I mean, it's still my first love, with comics. I remember I got into comics because largely over here we had a lot of humor comics, which were sort of weekly, and there's a few still left that sort of weekly humor comics that have lots of little strips of like 1 page or 2 pages. And then the main thrust of Action Comics came through Marvel UK. He used to print everything. They used to read. And they would do things like Star Wars Weekly, which would have Star-Lord in the background, in the backup strip, because it had the word "Star" in it. Or they do Transformers Weekly, and then in the back they do Machine Man, because he's a robot. That was the logic behind it. So. And then they brought out Secret Wars, and that blew my mind, because I don't think I'd really ever experienced superheroes before. And I suddenly realized there was this big joined universe where, when I first saw Spider-Man standing next to the Fantastic Four, and I couldn't quite believe that I'd never realized they were all in the same world. Right. So that, I was really young. So yeah, I'm a massive superhero fan, a huge DC fan, because we couldn't find them over here when I was growing up. DC Comics weren't widely read. And so... and for me at the minute, I think one of the best books they're doing is Joker, which James Tynion is writing. If you're reading the Bat books, they're obviously brilliant at the minute. Joker is incredible, just to show what you could do within that kind of universe. It's basically a very noir story of Jim Gordon, who is now, he's not commissioner anymore. He's freelance, and he's been given a commission to go and kill the Joker, who's hiding out in Europe. And it's just wonderful. It's very, very literary. It's got great action. It's perfect. Definitely go and read that. But yeah, so some of the other books that I've loved recently. I don't know if you've read. Did you read Scout's Honor from Aftershock? David Paposi.
Yeah, I read the first issue of that, but I didn't finish it. At least it's on my to-read list. Yeah,
definitely. That's the kind of book I love. I'm a real post-apocalyptic horror kind of guy, and so I love a good book like that. And so yeah, Scout's Honor is probably one of my favorite ones coming up of recently, and I'm loving what Scott Snyder's doing with his line at Comixology as well.
Gotcha.
I think I suppose I love it when a creator is given the chance to say, I'm going to show all the different elements of what I do. You know, and you see from the first one was that We Have Demons, which is just all out, you know, bat crazy. You know, and to some of the books, he's doing with Francesco Francavelli, he's done Night the Ghoul, which is sort of more classic horror kind of thing. I love that. I love seeing people's influences coming through in the same way that hopefully the influences I'm showing through Shadow Service land with people.
Yeah, no. The thing about those Scott Snyder books is he's bringing in, you know, he's a big name, but then he's also bringing in like massive, you know, creative talent along with him to do those books. It's very, very exciting. But it's
an exciting time at the minute for independence, you know. So, and I think it's that thing when you've got names like when you got the Scotts and James of this world sort of stepping out and creating their own imprints, really, because let's face it, that's what they're doing. It's that thing of, you know, a rising tide lifts all ships, and so it's while I love the big two, and I always be a superhero fan. I love the fact that the indie scene is so strong now, and it's so accepted as well. It seems to be. I think that's a lot to do with the fact that we've also living in a world where every TV streaming company wants as much IP as possible, so they're definitely looking for things. But you know, again, it's a good place to be at the minute because people are looking for stories, you know, and yeah, I've loved even you know, I've been going to things like San Diego for like 5-6 years now. Even in that time, to see the growth of places like Vault. You know, and you know, Vault has gone from 0 to 60 in no time whatsoever. And you sort of look at things like, and again, I'm showing my horror roots, but things like Autumnal by Daniel Kraus, it was amazing. That's sort of a very Wicker Man type story in full, where it's basically, if you love Wicker Man, you will love Autumnal. Or Mike Morisi's, the name's gone now. Is it Barbaric? No, not
Barbaric.
Barbaric,
yeah. Great, yeah.
It's funny because a lot of those things, a lot of the Vault books really do remind me of 2000 AD from the UK. That's
sure.
You know, there's definitely, when you think about 2000 AD, the writers of 2000 AD, the artists of 2000 AD led the sort of British invasion of Vertigo, and you know, in the 80s and 90s, and we're sort of seeing that kind of feel. You know, so again, a lot of those stories I could absolutely see in the pages of 2000 AD. So yeah, I'm loving what companies like Vault are doing, because they don't really have a house style. The house style is that they're good stories, you know. For sure. And yeah, the amount of work they're putting out at the minute is phenomenal.
Yeah, no, it's all like, I honestly can't think of a Vault book that I've read that I didn't like. So I mean, and that goes to say, you know, the same thing for Shadow Service. Like everybody out there, if you haven't had a chance, go check out Shadow Service. It's fantastic. And Cavan, thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I look forward to volume 3 or the next arc of Shadow Service. And yeah, I guess is there anywhere that people can find you on the internet where they could reach out to you if they have any questions, if they just want to check out what else you're doing? Sure.
Yeah. My website is cavanscott.com. And if you find me on Twitter, I'm on Twitter far too much. And that's just at Cavan Scott. And I think to complete the set, I'm on Instagram at Cavan Scott Writer. So yeah, come and find me. I love talking about comics, and I will happily to do that for the rest of the time I should be actually writing the comics. Let's put it that way.
Right. Well, thank you again so much. I really appreciate your time, and I think we're going to jump back to the show. And thank you again, Cavan. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
This week on I Read Comic Books, we are talking about the humongous series, Final Crisis, written by Grant Morrison. And honestly, I don't even think we have enough time in the episode to list all of the artists on this book. Paul, Kara, and I read this book. Paul came to me, and he knew that Kara was going to be in the episode, and said, "Hey guys, let's read this Grant Morrison book that I know that you both are excited to read. Let's read Final Crisis, but more importantly, let's read the Essentials edition, which comes with not just Final Crisis number 1 through 7, but also a bunch of little tie-in stuffs. And from the perspective of someone who just read the book and sat down, I don't know which was a Final Crisis story, which one wasn't. But all that being said, spoiler warning for pretty much everything surrounding Final Crisis, which came out a while ago. But if you haven't read it, pause that thing, go read the 400 pages of the Essentials edition, then come on back and we can talk about all things Superman versus Batgod. We can talk about the multiverse. We could talk about the Flashes running through time. There's so many things that we could potentially talk about. So I guess before we get into that noise,
Yep.
Can we get a quick summary, Kara, about what Final Crisis is?
And then Paul,
Mike, maybe you can follow up with another summary.
I'll try.
Okay. So I'm going to start with a summary and then get into my opinions.
We'll do summaries first, and then we'll...
No, okay. I know. Okay. I'm telling myself, Mike. I'm telling myself. Okay. All right. So once upon a time, Jack Kirby went to DC from Marvel in a huge huff, in a rage. And
quick summary, Kara.
Created a whole fourth world full of new gods and the bad world of Apocalypse. And some say that this was Jack Kirby's way of building a backdoor to the Marvel universe from the DC universe. Because this whole corner of the DC universe that also included the Forever People and characters like Kamandi the Last Boy are all Kirby in this little corner playpen of the DC universe, because DC was like, whatever you want to do, buddy, just do it.
Right.
So this is important because these characters form the core structure of DC's Final Crisis, which was published in 2009, I want to say.
In 2008.
2009.
Yep.
Yeah, I was in college. This is like real flashbacks to me being in my dorm reading all these books spread out in front of me. Okay, so the bad guys on Apocalypse have decided to infiltrate the Earth by possessing the bodies of people and bringing their overlord Darkseid, who will unify the entire multiverse under his unity of thought. And the heroes don't know that this is going on, and there's all these little side stories. You get a glimpse of the DC version of the Monitor characters who oversee all the multiverses and are just watching everything, but they are starting to have personalities and feelings and narrative arcs because they've been infected by narrative. Because Grant Morrison. Barry Allen, the second Flash, who famously disintegrated to death during DC's first huge crossover book, Infinite Crisis, in the 80s, is not dead. He's just been outrunning death, who is the Black Zoom, the Black Flash. And he has been running so fast that he blipped out of Infinite Crisis time into Final Crisis time, so that he and Wally West, the third Flash, could lead death to Darkseid at the crucial moment. Meanwhile, Superman is taken out of time, away from his dying wife, Lois Lane, so that he can molecularly merge with the evil Superman from a different parallel Earth in order to punch a space vampire. And the Batman has been hooked up to one of the Apocalypse crony machines to make the ultimate soldier clones, but Batman is so traumatized that his trauma burns through all of their plans. And bad guys lose because good triumphs. Okay. I am struggling so hard because this entire book is tangents. I don't even want to talk about the Marvels because I'm going to get very upset talking about Mary Marvel.
Okay. So Paul,
your counterpoint.
Yes.
I don't see how you can't like this book based on that summary. I mean, what's not to like? No, I think the crux of the book again is Morrison trying to do a big crisis level crossover event story, but they do it in a way that fits their worldview in a sense. and its attempt to make a crisis feel like an actual crisis, and what it would actually feel like if there was a black hole caused by Darkseid falling backward through time and landing on Earth. And the whole story is sort of built around the idea where space-time is collapsed. Darkseid finds a way to enslave humanity with the anti-life equation. Meanwhile, Superman discovers there's an even bigger threat, which is a giant space vampire that was a monitor. And in the end, the good guys win because Superman uses the miracle machine to wish for a happy ending. There you go. Right. That's Final Crisis.
Oh, is that what happened?
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Oh my God.
It says it in the book.
Okay. Yeah. So,
guys, this is I'm just going to say it right off the bat, and I promise I have constructive things to talk about, but this book is the reason I stopped buying comics for several years.
So, okay, and I can kind of understand that.
Sure.
If only, so coming at this book, I remember when this book was coming out, and I remember seeing the covers. Man, I've never seen cooler fucking comic book covers in my life, except for on top of the ones, at least at the time, that were coming out with Final Crisis. Some of those Darkseid, like with the Omega symbol on his hands and stuff, that's some of the coolest shit you can see in comic books, right?
Super bold.
So I remember thinking, man, DC must be having a moment, right? Because I, at the time, was not reading DC. It was 2009, and I was very much like, I only read Marvel comic books. Like, that was who I was. That's how high pitched my voice was at the time too. Is this a strange thing 13 years ago? But yeah, so I remember thinking like, man, this must be a huge thing. Marvel's got its own events going on, so there's no way I could even get hooked into this. And I had no real interest in reading a lot of DC books. And again, doing this show has opened my eyes to so many different comic books and trying new characters and all that stuff. So with my foray into DC over the past, since 2009 when this came out, I feel like I have a decent grip on like a lot of characters. I kind of understand the basics, maybe the big 10, maybe the big 15 over at DC.
Sure.
Sitting down to read this book, I know nothing about DC.
No.
I've never read a DC book before. Everything that I thought I knew didn't matter. And I don't think that is a fault of Grant Morrison. I don't think that is a fault of me. I just think that the type of story that was being told required you to be invested in DC Comics.
Yes and no.
And I should point out that the DC universe has been rebooted twice since this book came out. So I mean, what you're reading now is not the same as the universe that this was. So,
yeah.
So Mike, yes and no, because one of my big frustrations with this book is that there were a lot of main characters who were created specifically for this book. So for someone like me who had been very invested in the DC universe and was reading everything, every lead up to this crisis, every tie-in book, pre-Wikipedia, reading the DC Comics Encyclopedia book like it was the Bible, like trying to figure out who was who and everyone's backstory.
Yeah.
And then they give me Final Crisis and say, this is it, guys. And like half the characters are made up for this book. So for me, that diminished the stakes.
Okay.
So like all the monitors made up. I mean, yes, they're all made up, but like for this book, the monitors are made up. The space vampire was not like a thing. There was like I think reading this now, a super cringe-worthy level of focus on this like Japanese super team that just feels like a white dude's understanding of Japanese pop culture at the time manifested as a superhero team.
Maybe.
And they have a lot of speaking time. And I'm like, but we don't know who they are and we don't care about them. And they're cringe.
For the record, can I just say that my interpretation of that, the Super Young team, the Japanese superhero team, is Morrison doing an updated version of the Forever People, which is why Sonny Sumo shows up and joins the team. So I get Forever People part of the, but again, if you don't know Jack Kirby's Fourth World, you would never make that connection. So I think that's one fault of the book.
I did not make that connection.
Those connections are not made clear.
Kamandi, the last boy, shows up for like 2 panels, and if you don't know who Kamandi is, you're just like a long
Wait, is that
boy.
Is that the guy who was sitting on the island in the Statue of Liberty was in the background, and I was like Planet of the Apes moment? Okay.
Yep.
That's Kamandi. Didn't know what the fuck was going on with that. So okay.
Okay, so there's a lot of heavy featuring of Frankenstein, Agent of Shade, And
Right.
if you're not a nerd about that particular subsection of DC Comics Silver Age, you don't know who that is. I didn't know who that was. And he's heavily featured, which fine, but
so I guess, I don't want to necessarily we could go down this path for a little while, I think. And I do want to kind of come back to
my point is, like, even as someone, like, I considered myself a well-versed DC fan, and this book I was like, who, why, who?
Sure. So I guess my question for Paul, I know that this is a book that you were very excited about. You wanted us to read it. And like, I'm glad that I read it. Like, honestly, all things considered, I think that it puts a new perspective on Grant Morrison's writing for me, as well as kind of gives me another set of doors to open in the DC universe that I didn't know were there in the first place. So what was it that made you want to revisit this book?
Okay. Just a little background here. So, this book was the book that got me reading comics again, in a sense. Whereas for Kara, it was her exit. For me, it was my entry. I had not been reading superhero comics regularly. You really are the Earth 2 version, or Earth 3. I can't keep track.
Oh
We're
my God.
kind of our opposites in that regard. Yeah.
But this is why I agreed to do this episode. This is why I'm revisiting my trauma, because because we're so opposite on Grant Morrison.
Yeah. I know it's very funny to me.
I enjoy talking about. I had to find out how this would happen.
I enjoy talking about Grant Morrison with you. So that's one of the reasons I picked this book. Again, I remember reading it when it was coming out. I just started going back to comic shops regularly. Again, Mike, seeing those covers and being a deep DC fan since I was a kid, I said, yes, this is speaking to me. I had read Morrison's Justice League when it was coming out in the 90s, but I had not read a lot of their other big important works at that point. So it was a little overwhelming at first, but I dove into that. I'm like, okay, I don't quite get what's going on here. I need to know more. And I found myself really taken with the idea that Morrison was structuring the typical superhero crossover world reality ending event and hyper compressing it in a way that no one else really does. This is a time, we're talking 2008, 2009, when the buzzword around comics, when I was getting back into it, was decompressed storytelling. So you have Brian Michael Bendis spending 12 issues to give you the Spider-Man origin story. You know what I mean? Morrison takes it in the opposite direction and says, I'm just going to give you not even the highlights. I'm going to give you the stuff that's happening in between the highlights of the story. It's all interstitial moments compressed into a story. And I was really taken with that. And as the story went on, I found myself really enjoying the idea of an event that didn't function maybe cohesively as a narrative, but was filled with a lot of great ideas that were just hit or miss. And if they landed, cool. If they didn't, you're on to the next idea. It was almost like Morrison doing a 21st century version of a Jack Kirby comic, which is essentially what it is.
Sure.
And when I reread it for this episode, I see the flaws a lot more clearly. It is a deeply flawed comic. Don't get me wrong. This is a mess. It does not work in a lot of ways. But the moments where it clicks for me, it clicks on an emotional level that I really, really cherish. I think I really love reading this comic while at the same time recognizing and checking off the checklist of all of its flaws. So I'm glad we're talking about it, because I think there's a lot here to unpack, both good and bad.
Sure. I mean, like, some of the things that I really liked about this book were like the mystery of how Orion died, and how like all of the various DC characters investigated in their own different ways, right? And we had a ton of fucking people trying to figure out, how did this god die? Like, what is this bullet? How did this bullet end up? It was like carbon dated 50 years in the past. Like, it's comic books, but I still found myself like really interested in the mystery that was there. I liked how the Green Lantern Corps were like, well, we're here to do this thing. And then we end up with Dan Turpin being like, well, I'm this guy, I smoke cigarettes, and man, I'm angry. And Renee Montoya is also there. Like, and again, I know some of these characters and some of them I don't, but I thought that seeing the DC universe trying to like solve this mystery all together versus like them all getting their own book and having this just be a storyline in one of those books, I thought was really, really cool.
I will say the first half of the book is the best part. I mean, I think there's a lot of great stuff that happens once Superman goes to the bleed and meets the space vampire, but the first half of the book, when it is the straightforward New God story, I mean, that's my shit. And you glossed over the art team. I do want to say that J.G. Jones draws the big chunk of the main Final Crisis story. And his artwork is fantastic. I think it looks amazing. Eventually, Doug Mahnke takes over most of the art for the second half of the book. And that shift makes sense as things get crazier and even more comic booky. Doug Mahnke works better than J.G. Jones. Anyway. But yeah, those early few issues are fantastic. When you slowly see Darkseid taking over, when you realize that Morrison actually makes the New Gods interesting for the first time in a long time, and he makes Darkseid an actual scary villain. I'm sorry, they make Darkseid a scary villain. Because Darkseid's been working behind the scenes for years, laying the groundwork to eventually take over.
Well,
again, the story begins with Darkseid falling backwards through time, punching a hole through space-time.
But
that's the coolest thing ever.
Did I miss something in the book? Because I feel like this all happens in caption boxes, right?
Yes, that's one of my huge critiques, is that a lot of the story is like, here's a caption box and here's exposition about what just happened off panel. And I'm like, why?
Okay. I just want to make sure, because I genuinely felt like in the first 120 pages that I read in the first sitting, because I read this in 3 sittings. I mean, it's a long book. It's a long book. Like, it's not even that it was hard to read. It's just, it's a long book. And like, the first 120 pages, I just kept thinking like, am I missing something? Are there pages where I'm supposed to see these things happen?
Let me paint this picture for you. Final Crisis is the end point of a 52 issue weekly comic books.
Right.
We're counting. So 52 issues. That's not even including the miniseries prequels that led up to this book.
Right.
This was like the only thing DC was churning out for like a year or two was books related to Final Crisis. Like, this was the entire universe.
And and that's fine, right? Like, I think that like the thing that really I think confused me is that I didn't take the approach to this book that I should have, which was, this is a big, insane manga storyline that's happening. And if I had just approached it with like, roll with every single punch that comes in caption dialogue boxes, because I do it all the time in weekly shonen books that I read, and I just go, oh, and then they, this whole thing is healed, and they show like one panel of a city that's like a quarter of an inch by a half an inch, right? And I go, oh, okay, they fixed this huge problem, and then the story can continue. If I had just approached this book like that, I don't think I would have had as many problems in asking for more continuity throughout this storyline, because ultimately it all makes sense. By the time I got to the end, I went, yep, all the pieces lined up. It took a really weird path to get there. It looked exactly like the Omega Beam or whatever Darkseid shot at the end, but you know what? We got there, and that's all that mattered. So I don't know. I guess, Kara, did you have anything that you pulled out of this book that you liked in your second reading here?
Well, before I get into that, I do want to make it very clear to you also, Mike, that when there were a couple issues in here that were just devoted to Superman's mating versions of himself punching the space vampire sidebar. Those comics were published with 3D printed glasses, like 3D glasses.
No.
So when you when in the comic, there's that awkward moment where the mystery person that shows up to say, Superman, you have to step outside of time and save everything. And then she's like, and you have to turn on your 4D vision. That's when you put on your 3D glasses, your little, like, your blue lens and your red lens. And the whole rest of the book was 3D printed with those inks.
No fucking way.
And I'm so sorry you couldn't experience this.
That's so great.
That explains the bizarre layouts of those pages.
Yes.
Oh man,
exactly.
That's I mean, I know it's a gimmick, but that's kind of a cool gimmick.
It's a super gimmick.
It's the best. It's awesome.
Yeah.
Look, with this book, when it came out, and I had been so invested in all of this, and I wanted to know everything and absorb everything. This was my problem with the recent Star Wars movies too. I read everything leading up to Rise of Skywalker, and then it was trash. So I read everything leading up to Final Crisis, and then I was like, what is going on? I don't understand what is happening. And rereading it 10 plus years later, with more knowledge about comic books, more experience talking about what makes a story resonate or an arc resonate, I could kind of see what Morrison was trying to do, and I could pick out what things I would have chosen to do to make the story resonate more for me. Like, I get that Morrison was trying to do like a thing with, it doesn't have to be linear because time is collapsing upon itself. So I'm going to reflect that experience, and the whole thing is going to feel disjointed because that's what these characters are experiencing. And I understand that's what he was trying to do, but I still don't like it. There was one character who showed up in like the Superman section, Captain Atom, I think, and everything that character said, I was like, oh, this is Grant Morrison's brain download. This character is Grant Morrison. So it was interesting to see that. I really do think in the notes I shriek about how this book is a giant Silver Age circle jerk, and I stand by that statement because that's not just this book. Like, DC has a real thing where they keep, at least during this period of time, they really hyper focused on these Silver Age heroes, or like harkening back to these things that happened with Infinite Crisis. Like, the Infinite Crisis event in the 80s was DC saying, hey, we tried this multiverse thing, but now it's confusing, so we're going to compress everything into a single timeline. And so Final Crisis, happening 25 years later, 30 years later, is them saying, never mind, we're going back to the multiverse. So them and I know there's 0 Hour and all of that, whatever. So them taking Barry Allen, the Flash, the second Flash, as kind of the parallel mirror connecting those two events, where he died in Infinite Crisis and nobody ever got over it, and it shaped the whole like Flash family narrative from that point on. And then having him reappear in Final Crisis, I thought those moments where he was interacting with other like Flash people was the part that resonated the most with me, because it felt the most grounded. Like, this book was all over the place, but whenever the Flashes were together, it felt like that was supposed to be the through line. And I never quite felt that it was the through line that it was made out to be, with the emotional weight that it had. So that for me was interesting. I really liked what they did with Tattoo Man. Tattoo Man is a supervillain who is covered in tattoos, and the tattoos can like come to life essentially as like force manipulations, if you will. Like, if he's got a dragon tattoo, the dragon will pop off of his skin and be able to attack things. Right. So
honestly, super cool fucking power if you ask me, but you know, whatever.
Yeah. And so Tattoo Man has this really nice arc where he becomes a hero, and I thought that would have been a really solid like emotional center for this book, but it was only like a piece of what was happening. And I get that in a multiverse shattering event, there's more than one person who can be the narrative center, but I do feel like having a narrative center would have helped this book be more coherent.
Sure. Yeah.
And again, I understand that the coherency is not the point, but I still hate it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I thought that storyline was funny, if only because we got to see Green Arrow and Black Canary, who I think I described Canary and Green Arrow being the horny mom and dad who have to run the Justice League headquarters and being pissed off about everything. Probably was some of the like really funnest, like the most fun moments in this entire story, of them just being like, fuck, everything's on fire and we can't have sex. What the fuck? And Oliver Queen just being pissed about everything, and Canary just being like, we have responsibilities, Oliver. It was great.
Right.
Yeah. Green Arrow is really such a treasure.
Yes. Yeah.
Especially when they remember his grumpy liberal roots.
Right.
Yeah, there's a moment where he's talking about, you know, when, because Darkseid's using the anti-life equation to take over the humanity, and Green Arrow says something to the effect of like, once these fascists takes over, prove I was right about everything. Right? He's still that like grumpy liberal. It's so good.
It's so but Green Arrow is such a funny character to me, because I'm tainted by the television show. So like whenever I read this kind of bubbly, fun Oliver Queen, I'm like, oh man, this is such a better character.
Well, because in Arrow, they tried to do Batman without using Batman.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
Sorry, I completely interrupted you, Paul. Go ahead.
I just want to say, you know, Kira, thank you for pointing out the positives in this book. And for me, it does come down to particular moments. Because again, narratively, I will agree, it is a mess. And Morrison's attempt to recreate the feeling of time collapsing doesn't always land. I think it's an interesting experiment. And I don't think the book is well served by being presented as a crossover event. I don't think any of the lead up countdown or any of those things did this book any favors.
Sure.
And I don't think it's very funny that Morrison decides about halfway through the book, you know what? What's more interesting than a New God story? A story about the monitors being corrupted by narrative. And there's this blood-sucking monitor who's basically a metaphor for editors ripping off creators. Like, that's the story I'm going to tell. Like, that becomes the story at the end.
Yeah.
Which is hilarious to me. I also will say that this collection doesn't do a good job of putting that in there because those Superman issues were coming out later in the story. Consecutively with the main story. So the second issue of the Superman Beyond story you should read that right before the last issue of Final Crisis. Mm-hmm. That's not the way it's organized, this collection. Yeah. Minor gripe. But as I was going to say, I think the moments really click. I love Grant Morrison's attempt to make a sort of meta-narrative meditation on what it means to be a superhero crossover event. At the same time, you do have Frankenstein riding a motorcycle in an awesome like double page spread. Yeah. And then you have Superman going off planet. And then you have Batman shooting Darkseid with a magic time traveling bullet. How can I love a comic where that happens? Right. Like I have to love that, And as I said, I think if you don't know Darkseid or the New Gods, I think it might be a confusing introduction, but Darkseid's presence in this book does feel very threatening. He actually feels like a supervillain. And a more interesting supervillain than he usually is presented. There's that moment in the last issue when Superman is holding Batman's like smoking corpse and he's confronting Darkseid. And Darkseid says, "What will you do when your friends, your enemies, your lover are all Darkseid? When there is one body, one mind, one will, one life that is Darkseid? Will you be the enemy of all existence then? What irony will that be, son of Krypton?" That is the kind of stuff I want from a Grant Morrison comic. That's such a good moment.
That was a really powerful, honestly, like it's so weird because you're totally right. Like there are moments in this book where I was like, cool, this is fucking comic books. This is what I want. That is exactly one of those moments. I also thought that Batman outsmarting the machine thing was actually kind of cool. Say what you will about how like ridiculous that was. I actually liked the fighting of the mind thing that happened. But yeah, moments like that kick ass in this run.
Yeah, you have to remember that Grant Morrison is also writing Batman at the same time. Yeah. So, that is a crossover to the main Batman series where Morrison is examining Batman's psyche. And the short version of that storyline is they're attempting to make a clone Batman army and Batman weaponizes his traumatic memories to short circuit it. That's pretty fucking cool.
Yeah.
I mean,
if a little glorifying of the trauma. Look, I dredged up 2 more things that I liked. How's that?
Okay, cool.
Okay. Superior Lex Luthor content.
Okay.
In this book.
100%.
Yes.
Yeah.
Every time Lex Luthor opened his mouth, I was like, why are you not the center of this story? Which I'm sure is exactly what Lex Luthor would also want.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
But it was just like pitch perfect Lex Luthor being like, fine, if I have to, I'll save the day. I get the credit for this, Superman. How does it feel that I'm out heroing you?
Another perfect moment at the end of the story. Yeah.
Look, I'm watching the new DuckTales series on Disney Plus, and it was like watching Flintheart Glomgold yelling at Scrooge McDuck, being like, haha, I'm the better rich Scotsman. Like, it was so quality. I also thought that, I was saying like, oh man, Mike, it makes total sense that you have no idea what's going on, because this is like Grant Morrison dredging the depths of Z-list characters to be like, look who my favorite is. But such fascinating use of the Ray. The Ray is like, I would put him at C-list, like C-list Justice League. The Ray is a character who can turn himself into generally like a beam of light. Mm-hmm. And in Final Crisis, he's like, actually, I can manifest as any kind of wavelength. Of course I can be your teleportation beam. And I'm like, rad.
This is why
let's do that.
Grant Morrison was the natural writer for New X-Men when he was like, hey, guess what? Secondary mutations. Just get clever with it. And then he fucking left. And that's been the basis of X-Men since he left the brand. Like, come on. Their mind is incredible.
And yeah, I thought that was very well done. When can I talk about the things I had problems with?
Go ahead, Paul. Go ahead.
Wait, one more point I want to make.
Go, Paul.
Again, I have to say we're only scratching the surface. Like Mike and I both been saying, there's so many great moments in this book, and I think it works better as a collection of interesting ideas and moments rather than a cohesive story. So your mileage may vary depending what you want from a comic book. So there are things that, for me, like I said, hit very emotionally hard. Mike, you talked about Dan Turpin, the character that Darkseid takes over. Mm-hmm. If you've read Kirby's Fourth World, the New Gods series, Dan Turpin is a detective who stands up against Orion and Calabac when they're having a knockdown, drag-out fight in the middle of a city. Dan Turpin is the ultimate example of humanity standing up against the gods, the new gods. So him being taken over for Darkseid is a huge emotional moment. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. If you don't know that, it just seems like a random dude. So I can understand the frustration of this book. So yeah, I think my final point, my final crisis, final thought, in terms of what I like, is those moments where you do have these big ideas playing out on a grand scale. We didn't even mention the fact that the Ray uses his power to draw a magic sigil on the face of the earth to save it. There's so much, there's so much going on that it's overwhelming, but once you kind of like let yourself be taken by those moments, it's a very enjoyable read.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that. Yeah. Now we can criticize it.
No, I will say I slipped up earlier before. I misused Morrison's pronouns. I should have said they instead of as he earlier. So that's a mistake on my part. I just want to call that out here. But Kara, let's dig in. I have one massive point that I want to make about my biggest problem with the entire book.
Mm-hmm. Go.
And it's not even a comic book thing. It is the fucking lettering in this book.
Really?
It's atrocious. Yes. This is the worst lettered, structured book I've ever read in my life. This is a 400-page book. This is a 400-page book. And I'm so, people work very hard on comics, and I don't want to disparage anybody, but I've never in my life had to reread so many pages to understand the order of everything, because I for the most part felt like I got the gist of a page, and then I'd go back and then I'd see that the letters were guiding my eyes back up to the panel that I was just at, and I went, whoa, was I supposed to read it in that order? And this wasn't just like one off, because you get this every once in a while where there's just like page layout's tough and lettering can be tough, and I get it. Numerous pages in numerous issues. I could have, I had to read this book in 3 sittings. It wasn't because the book was long. It was because the lettering made me reread pages multiple times to make sure that I understood the context on things. How do you approve a page that looks like this? I could literally go through the Hoopla digital version that I read and screen cap dozens of pages where that was a problem. And I just... shame on DC for proofing this and saying that this was good. I, honest to God, think this is one of the worst lettered books I've ever read in terms of layout and structure. And I can't get over how frustrating that was to read a book where I'm kind of out of context of the story and then thinking I'm misinterpreting what's going on because the lettering's bad. Like, unforgivable in a lot of ways. I can't believe it.
Yeah. I had a couple pages where I thought that, but I just chalked it up to nothing matters. This narrative isn't going to be coherent anyways. I'm just going to let it wash over me as much as possible. Okay. This is intentional. It's all a terrible, terrible intention. Look, so thinking about this book and revisiting it, I realized that a lot of my problems with this are the same problems that the Star Wars prequels had. Mm-hmm. You have your creator who had a very specific vision and wanted to do a lot of stuff, and it's very visually cluttered, and nobody said, should we do that thing? It didn't feel like there was an editor saying, maybe this should be more understandable. There was just, it felt like it could have benefited from somebody else being like, do you need a panel that's just for a Captain Carrot cameo? Is that furthering the narrative?
Of course you do. Of course.
I was not mad about that.
Look, my biggest problems with this book, revisiting it, accepting that Grant Morrison was going for a time is collapsing, so there isn't going to be a chronology, accepting that, my major problems with this book are the fact that a lot of the interesting things that seem to have happened off panel and were immediately explained in a caption. that was frustrating for me as a reader, because they would say, and then this cool thing happened, like a boom tube appears, but you just see the word boom, and then on the next page it's like, and a boom tube appeared and we got teleported. And I'm like, why the fuck wouldn't you show that? and
Sure,
stuff like there's that 2-page spread build up for like Superman coming back to that present moment on that specific Earth, and everyone's starting to do the look up in the sky dialogue. And then you turn the page off of this double page spread that's all build up to Superman reappearing, and the panel that shows Superman first, it's not even a half-page panel. It's like a quarter-page panel, and Superman is shown like in profile, moving parallel to the ground. Like there's nothing dynamic happening in the panel. It's like that kind of buildup. I would have expected a full page. Like that's what you need, a full page spread. You want everyone looking up at the sky, and all of a sudden all the Supermen burst back into reality as like a single or double page spread.
Sure.
And that is not what happened. And so I was like, there felt like some wasted moments like that. My other major critique, now that, again, I'm older and wiser and know how to talk about these things, this book treats women like trash. Like so many butt shots, crotch shots, calling each other sluts. Wonder Woman has like no speaking lines and is like very early on gets turned into an evil female Fury with like this weird ugly dog mask, and they never talk about how it happened. They don't show her struggling to overcome this programming. It's just all of a sudden she's bad now. We gave her a whip. Isn't she hot? And like the character of Mary Marvel, Mike, this was like a whole thing where I was like, oh, is Mike going to know what's going on with the Marvels?
Well, okay, so like I kind of did. I knew that they all can say like a special word and then they turn into a powerful being, because I know that there's like a family of them. But I was like, why is this one R-rated? And why is she so like want to kill everybody with sex?
So so there was this whole buildup where they're like, Mary Marvel is done being like the innocent golden girl. Now she's bad. And you find out in Final Crisis that it's because she's been possessed by Granny Goodness, who is like the bad lady in Apocalypse.
Right.
But
she was possessed by Desaad, who is the Darkseid's like right hand man who gets his jollies from torturing people.
Right.
Hence
The
his name
Alpha,
Desaad.
I see.
The Alpha Lantern was possessed by Granny.
Right.
I just read it and I'm confused by it. So, but Mary Marvel's whole thing, like it really felt like they just, like the way that they portrayed her. I get that they were trying to be like, she's been possessed by a gross old man god, but they like shaved her head in a weird way and put her in leather and made her like rub her crotch over Captain Marvel Jr. in a way that's like, your spine doesn't work like that. And it just, the whole thing was super gross. And I was like, really? Like she calls Supergirl a slut, and then immediately afterwards one of the bad guys says like a rape joke about how Luthor can have Supergirl first. And I'm just like, really?
Yeah.
Like the only women in this book who seemed to have a voice at all were Black Canary, and you see her in the context of having sex with or being in love with Oliver Queen. The Flash wives, which you see in context of them being their wives and being saved by their magical Flash kisses, and Renee Montoya, who's a lesbian. So like, it seems like being a lesbian is the only superpower worth having in the DC universe at this time, because then they don't objectify you. Except wait, they do, because Batwoman was also a female Fury and she doesn't say anything. And the one time you really like see her, she's got her like pony dog's reins in her teeth. And I'm like, first of all, you're going to lose a cap that way. And second of all, what the fuck? So
yeah, and I think we'll have to link to the previous episode where Kara and I talked about Grant Morrison, because you brought up a lot of these same criticisms with their other work, which was stuff I was kind of blind to, and I appreciate that, because rereading it, that stuff is way cringier, edgelord than I realized at the time when it first came out. And you can kind of attempt to hand wave it by saying, yes, Mary Marvel's taken over by Desaad, this creepy old guy, or Morrison's simply trying to make the villain seem even worse by making them say these comments or these rape jokes. None of that lands. No. It has not aged well. It didn't age well when it came out, and has gotten even worse since. So yeah, I can agree with all those criticisms.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just like, oh my God, so many butts. So many butts.
A lot of butts.
Yeah. I mean, I still have a lot of questions about like what were the significance of the tiger people? I missed all of that.
Okay,
and why was Darkseid's son?
Marvels.
Okay, go ahead.
So Tawny, the good tiger man, is a companion to the Marvel gang, which were brought over from Fawcett Comics. They, you know how like Captain Marvel, the DC version, not the Marvel version, Captain Marvel was with Superman in the out of space, out of time with all the other Supermen, and he was like, oh, he's from a purer world. I was like, that's Fawcett Comics.
Okay.
Because DC bought Fawcett Comics, who was doing all the Marvel stuff, and then DC's like, you're in our world now. So like you see Captain Marvel in the context of being part of that like Fawcett Comics world, but then in like the main narrative of Final Crisis happening on the Earth with all the heroes, you see Captain Marvel Jr. and Mary Marvel being possessed, and then Tawny, the tiger, who mentions that he has to get his jetpack out of storage, which like, cool. Then show him using the jetpack. Like, what the fuck? So they were doing a thing where like Calabac, one of Darkseid's sons, like what they like made a throwaway comment that the Apocalypse bad guys were making human animal hybrids. They said that in a throwaway one panel, and then like several issues later, Calabac is like a tiger man with an army of tiger men, and that's who's fighting.
Okay, I did kind of follow that. I just felt like there was some significance that I wasn't getting, but if it was just that throwaway line becoming the later beat, that makes sense, I guess.
I think the idea is that if you read Jack Kirby's Commandy, there's a clan of tiger people, for lack of a better word, talking tigers. And I think the implication is that all of the experiments that the New Gods are doing on animals are taking place in Command D, the bunker, and that becomes Commandy's world in the future. So Morrison's kind of collapsing that. Yeah,
I see.
I got that joke very belatedly only on this second read through, and I was like, come on.
Well, I mean, that's in the Kirby comic. I mean, Kirby made that joke, so blame Jack.
Damn it, Jack.
Well, I guess, do you guys have any final points about this? I like, again, I have other questions, but like, maybe we could talk about them after. But I just want to, like, I do want to say, like, I'm glad that I read this. Like, I finally get some of the like bigger significant things that I think are kind of like alluded to in other comics that I read in DC every once in a while. I know that it's been quite a long time since Final Crisis, and we're in a much different continuity, but I still feel like there are remnants of this that still play through. If maybe that's just DC Comics in general, but like I still feel like Morrison's impact is there. Obviously, people want them to come back and write more comics. Everyone's always very excited when Morrison's on a comic. So like, I think people really still resonate with their writing. But yeah, I'm glad to have at least experienced this. You know, I feel like every time I pick up a DC event, I go, man, this is so different compared to Marvel events. I can understand the appeal. I just don't know if they always work for me. So I guess that's like my final thought here. Kara, what do you have any final thoughts here?
DC is never going to let go of their past. They can reboot as many times as they want, but they can't help themselves. That's why this whole thing was a Silver Age explosion, and why so many of like the key things that happened were harkening back to Infinite Crisis from the 80s. Barry Allen, the Flash coming back, Superman holding Batman's charred body is like one of the most iconic images of Infinite Crisis, riffed on, where he's holding dead Supergirl.
Right.
So like stuff like that, like DC just won't let it go. Like that's why you have to like know so much going in, because how else are you going to be like, oh, I guess you're going to highlight Aquaman for a panel and then never show him again because I'm supposed to be excited that Aquaman is back. Was he gone? Why is he here? Why are you pointing out that he's back in one panel? I'm so confused. Look, so overall, my critique of this is I thought there were some weird art choices being made to carry the narrative through. Do not like how the female characters were portrayed, and again, I cannot separate this book from the context of all the other books leading up to it. And in many ways, I did think the books leading up to it were better, and maybe that's just because they were trying to do less or they had more space. Like, I really liked the count. I remember really liking the Countdown comic book series, which was 52 weekly issues of what was like leading up to this event. I remember really liking that. When it was coming out, I liked the Crime Bible miniseries. Like, you kept hearing about this Crime Bible in this Final Crisis, and they never really go into it, but there was like a whole lead up about that where Renee Montoya as the Question was exploring this like evil Bible cult. And like that shit was awesome. Right. And then they like sort of mention it, but not really get into it. And it's like, if you didn't read that miniseries, do you know what they're talking about?
I completely forgot that was in the book. So yeah, thank you for reminding me of what I thought was a cool little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
So like there's all the, like, I felt like it was just so much build up and then disappoint for me.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I mean, it is what it is. There were some very nice moments where, if again you were a huge DC nerd, like maybe you were like me and you really liked that moment where Wonder Woman at the start, before she gets evil, yells "Hola" while she punches somebody, and you're like, that's Spanish hello, but that's also like her battle cry from the 40s that William Moulton Marston put in like all of his scripts. And if you know that, you're like, oh, she said the thing.
Right.
Sure.
So like there were some cute moments like that, but now that I'm more about like, hey, let's make sure that like somebody can pick up a comic book and not immediately wonder why anybody reads comic books ever. Like not like every book has to be like a Marvel Now book, but there should be like a baseline of coherency in these things.
Sure.
And I felt like things like Superman punching a space vampire should have been awesome, but for me, I was just confused and bored. I was like, why? This should be cooler. Why is this not cooler?
Okay.
Maybe I just want too much from my books.
I mean, again, maybe a Grant Morrison part 3 is coming. We can get into it.
Yeah.
Paul, I as the person who was kind of driving this whole thing, what are your final thoughts on here before we wrap up the episode?
I will say this. I think Final Crisis, I enjoy rereading it. I'm glad I took time to reread it and talk about with you both today. It's an interesting experiment. Like I said, it is a mess, but I'd rather have an interesting mess rather than a safe, I don't know, what's the opposite of a mess? Something safe.
Marvel's Axis. I don't know.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. I think Morrison tries a lot. I do know, if you read about the history of this book, their initial pitch was that after the New Gods died, the core Justice League members of the DC universe would become the new Gods. Obviously, DC didn't do that. So I think there's a lot of attempts to reconfigure a bigger idea into something more manageable. All that being said, I really like it as a New Gods story. I think the fact you do have Darkseid essentially winning at the end and then Superman defeating him by singing a song, that's crazy. Like, that's the kind of stuff I want from a comic book.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you
let him finish.
and Darkseid killing Orion by shooting a bullet backwards through time because it travels through the Flash's like slipstream. All that stuff. There are so many amazing, over-the-top, ridiculous comic booky moments that work for me. I'm willing to sort of overlook the sort of messiness of the narrative to just enjoy those moments that spoke to me when I read it as a fan coming back to DC for a long time, after a long time gone. And now even more after reading more of Morrison's stuff, they hit even harder for me. So I enjoy it. I celebrate its messiness. At the same time, I celebrate its successes.
Gotcha.
I have a nitpick and a comment.
Sure.
my nitpick from what Paul just said is talking about the Superman using a song to defeat Darkseid. That is going back to my point of good ideas, bad execution. Like that, if that was supposed to be a pivotal moment, why was it a regular size panel? Why wasn't it a full page of the music weaving through everything and disassembling things? And
we only got so many
like
pages in this huge comic book.
But that's what I'm saying. Like things that felt important were not given the visual impact of saying this is an important moment. And maybe the point was that all of the moments were important, but there were moments like that where I was like, this feels like it should be a splash page.
Yeah.
My comment based on what Paul said about like maybe he liked more chaos, I figured it out. in the DC universe, you're Hawk and I'm Dove. You're serving the agents of chaos and I'm serving the agents of order. Just give me a fucking coherent narrative, damn it.
And I'm Jimmy Olsen.
There you go.
So I think this is where we're going to wrap things up. I'm, again, very glad that I read this. Very glad to get deeper into the mind of Grant Morrison and to understand Paul and Kara a little bit better. I think I understand both of you better now having read this.
We are the opposite person.
Right. And that's,
Yes.
you know what? And that's totally fine. I'm glad to have you both as friends and folks on the podcast. So yeah, I guess everybody at home really curious to know what you think about Final Crisis, because apparently this is a very divisive book.
Yes.
So shoot us an email, ircbpodcast@gmail.com. Next week's episode is going to be me and Nick and Renee. We're going to be just talking about comics. We're going to experiment with a new show format where we kind of just sit and talk about comics for the full episode. It's going to be really interesting. I hope you guys check it out next week. Come listen live on Discord. But until then, you can follow us all on Twitter. You can follow Kara at KaraSSam. You can follow Paul at Oh Hi Paulie. You can follow me at Mike Rappin. And you can follow the show on Twitter and Instagram and on our brand new TikTok at IRCB Podcast, where I'm on TikTok. I'm trying to post clips from the show. It's kind of fun. People seem to like it, at least.
Unfortunately, I'm legally too old to download TikTok, so I guess I'll never know.
That's all right.
This episode first aired on Patreon and is possible because of our wonderful Patreon supporters. Join today for exclusive series like the IRCB Movie Club, Saga of Saga, and so much more. You can do that over at patreon.com/IRCB Podcast. If you haven't already, please take a minute to rate and review the show. I think 5 stars is a fair rating. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. It honestly helps to spread the word about the show and spread the word about IRCB.
You can join our IRCB Discord community to chat, comics, and more, and listen to our episodes live as we record. And we say listen, but you can also chat us in the chat box while you're listening.
That's true.
Which we will respond to you while that's happening. You can check that link in our show notes, and it would help us a lot if you tell your friends or your local comic shop about the show.
Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They do all of our music, and we can't thank them enough for that. Xander is a cool guy who makes us sound even cooler every week. Thanks to him, you get to hear our wonderful voices every week. I want to say thank you to Paul and Kara for joining me on this episode. Thank you to Brian and Danny for hanging out with us in the chat. Everyone out there who listens to the show and interacts with us, and all of our Patreon supporters, thank you so much. And until next time, comics are good, and so are you.